Hello everyone, welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Tefillin, and we will be learning today Emir Tzah Hashem, Daf Samach Amid Aleph, and a nice piece of Samach Amid Beis. So we pick up on Samach Amid Aleph with a new Siman, second line down in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Lamed Hey, Din Minyan Hashitin, the halacha that governs the amount of lines that are supposed to be in the writing of the parashiyos. Ubay sif echad, and here we have one sif. Says the Mechaber, Nohagu, the minig is, Nohagu, b'minyan hashitin, we have a minig regarding the number of lines that the parashiyos should be written in, lichtayv b'shal yad shiva, so that the parashiyos of the shal yad, each amud, each column, should contain 7 lines. Shiva shited b'chol parsha. Each one of the parashiyos should be written in 7 lines. So let's remember, the shalyad is written on one strip of parchment, and we write 4 parashiyos. Kadesh in one amud, Vayiki v'yacha in another amud, Shema and v'ahavta in another amud, and V'haya Shemaya in the 4th amud. Says the Mechaber that the minig is that each parsha would be written in 7 lines. Now let's remember that the 4 parshas don't each contain the same amount of words, right? Shema and V'ahavta are clearly a lot shorter than V'haya im Shemaya. Yet you made sure to write each one of those parshas in 7 lines. You could change the width of the column. You could make the column wider, so that, let's say, V'haya im Shamaya, you make the column wider, so you get more words to a line, and you write 7 lines. Shema and V'ahavta, you can make it narrower, so you get less words per line, but you make it 7 lines. Ubishal Roish, and in the writing of the Shal Roish, Arba Shitin. Each parsha should be written in 4 lines. But ultimately, says the Mechaber, V'im Shina, if you change from this format, loy pasal, it does not pasal the tefillin. Says the Mishnah Berurah about halfway down into the Mishnah Berurah here on Samach Amid Aleph. Mishnah Berurah is cut in Aleph, Nohagu. The Mechaber said that this is a minig. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what is this minig based on? Al pi ha-kabbalah biyad seifrim. We don't have this from a Gemara. This is a Kabbalah that was handed down throughout the Doros from Sefer to Sefer, ish mi pi ish. And he brings this down from the Torah, and the truth is that this sif in Shulchan Aruch is really verbatim from the Torah. Eiskan Beis b'minyan hashitin, so we have this minig regarding the amount of lines in the parsha. V'chein, and similarly, says the Chavetz Chaim, yesh Kabbalah b'yadam, the Seifrim also have a Kabbalah, ish mi pi ish, be'inyan haschalas rashi hashuris, regarding each line, what the first word on the line should be. B'shal yad u'b'shal roish. Both by the shal yad and the shal roish, kemavur b'tor u'b'beis Yosef. If you take out a Torah and you take a look at the Torah, he gives you a list. He says that in the parsha of Kadesh, in the shal yad, where you're going to have 7 lines, he gives you the first word for every line. So when the Sefer writes it, he knows, okay, line number 1 is going to start with the word Vayedaber, and it's going to end with whatever word. The second line has to start with this word. And you adjust the sizes of the letters accordingly, and you can see this list brought down in the Torah. However, the Chavetz Chaim says, V'seifrim ka'hayoim, the Seifrim nowadays, ein medaktikin b'tchilas rashi ashurais, they are not medaktik, they're not careful to follow that formula brought down in the Torah, to have those specific words beginning each line, u'mishanim kasha yizdamin lahem, and they change the first word on the line, however the writing falls out. V'haroid seladaktik, says the Chavetz Chaim, if a Sefer does want to be careful, and he does want to follow the formula of the Torah, and start the lines with those words, lo yimshach oisiyoitz o yikatzer harbe, don't make certain letters very wide or other letters very narrow, kedei lechavein rashi hashitos, in order so that it should fall out, that should be the first word on the line. Ki ein noile tefillin, because that doesn't make beautiful tefillin. Alva ma'at rashoy, but to do that a little bit you can. In other words, what the Chavetz Chaim is saying is like this. If you want to follow the format of the Torah, so you know what the first word on each line has to be. So you know what words you have to get onto a line. Sometimes it'll come out that there aren't so many words on the line. And we learned earlier in Siman Lamed Beis that the margins, the left margin and the right margin, have to be even. In the parlance of today's word processors, the column has to be center justified. So it's going to be even on both sides, right? So how do you fill up a line with so few words? So you make a dalid, let's say, with a very long gag. You make a hey with a very long gag. Other letters, like a nun, you can make very, very narrow. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you're trying to do this, don't go ahead and make crazy wide letters or crazy narrow letters so that the tefillin doesn't look nice. It's not a nice ksav. In order to make that, you should have those words be the first words on the line. Mishnah Berurah says it's not kedai, and he brings this down from the Pri Megadim. Now we go to Ois Katan Gimel. Ultimately, the Mechaber said, V'imashina, if you change from this formula, if you don't have 7 lines in each parsha in the Shalyad, or 4 lines in the Sharosh, the Mechaber said, Mishina loy pasal, if you change, it is not pasal. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is true, bein b'Shalyad u bein b'Sharosh, both by the Shalyad and the Sharosh. V'im ein loy l'Shalyad rak klaf kotzer v'orech. Let's say you're writing a Shalyad, and the only piece of cloth that you have to write the parsha of the Shalyad is very short and very long. Now the Shalyad, l'chatchila, each parsha is supposed to be written in 7 lines. But this piece of cloth that you have is very short. How are you going to get 7 lines in there? Well, what you could do is you could write very, very, very small, thin letters. And then you might be able to cramp in 7 lines. Says the Mishnah Berurah, don't do that. Nira, it would seem, says the Chavetz Chaim, it would be better to change the number of lines and write a Shalyad, let's say, that only has 4 lines, rather than writing tiny, tiny, thin letters and squeezing 7 lines onto the parsha. Ein b'Mardechai b'alachas ketanei seifel chas tefillin v'huvel el siman lamed beisiv dalid. De bechlal zeh keli vanveyu. It is included in the requirement of zeh keli vanveyu. Right, we darshan from zeh keli vanveyu his noel lefanav b'mitzvahs, that you're supposed to beautify mitzvahs. You should have beautiful talis. You should have a beautiful esrig, a beautiful lulav, a beautiful sukkah. Right, you should also have beautiful tefillin. Zeh keli vanveyu. Says the Chavetz Chaim, he brings down from the Mordechai that included in the rule of Zeh Keli Vanveyu to have beautiful tefillin is lichtayv ksiva gasa b'miktsas, that you should write a somewhat larger ksiva. Shaloyu nimchakin mehera. When you write Ashuris letters very tiny, you also write them very thin, so they could rub out very easily. That is not beautiful. That's not Zeh Keli Vanveyu. So Zeh Keli Vanveyu requires us to write a little bit larger. Ubehemes, and the truth is, says the Chavetz Chaim, Anu Royan B'chush, we see very clearly, the B'ksivais Hadakos Sheregilin Eze Seifrim Kayoim Ba'avonosenu, that some of the Seifrim who write very small and very thin Ba'avonosenu Arabim, Motzoi Kama V'Kama Kalkulim, we find many, many problems in the Ksiva, Gam B'tchilas Ksivasan. Not only that it gets worn out and rubbed out later, but even right when they write it, it's not written properly. Shaloi Nichtavu Kedinon Machmas Takusan. Because they're writing so small, they don't actually write the letters Kahalacha. So the Chavetz Chaim is pushing, don't go for this tiny, tiny Ksav. Uberubam chaser kama v'kama tagin de shatnes gats. The letters of shatnes gats, shin ayin tes nun zayin gimel sadi soifis. Those letters are supposed to have tagin. They're supposed to have 3-pronged crowns. And he says, the Seifrim that write tiny letters, Ruba beruba, they leave out the Tagin. The Medina de Gemara. And the Tagin are required Medina de Shas. It's brought down in Gemara that you have to have the Tagin. There are some Rishonim that hold that if you're missing the Tagin, it's ma'akev even b'di'evet. V'shomer nafsho lo yikna parashiyos ke'ela b'sach tefillah. He says a shomer nafsho, somebody who watches out for the benefit of his neshama, should not buy such parashiyos in his tefillin. Unless he really checked them beforehand very well to make sure that they were written properly. V'yeda mikosav parashiyos, and he should also know who wrote the parsha, who was the cipher that wrote this parsha. The parashiyos ke'elu, because these types of parashiyos, says the Chavetz Chaim, motzei ma'od, it is very common, the kaisvein heimadayin na'arim, that they were written by kids, shalo yadu klal dinei ksiva stam, who are totally ignorant of the halachas of writing Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzos. So the Mishnah Berurah over here is pushing very, very hard against the minig of writing tiny letters on the parashiyos of the Tefillin. He says it's not Zekeli Van Veyu because they could become rubbed out very quickly. And also he says even if not for that problem, he says the fact is that when they write so tiny and so thin, very often the letters are not really written kedinon or ketikunon. They're not written the way they're supposed to be. He brings down one example that on these tiny parshas you find a lot of missing tagin, which makes sense because if you're writing tiny, the tagin take up a lot of room. So they leave out the tagin. So the Chavetz Chaim is very, very unhappy with this minig. Okay. Now we go to Siman Lamed Vav, Diktuk Ksivasan. The care that we have to exercise when writing the tefillin, Ubay Gimel Se'ifim, and here we have 3 Se'ifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, Tzarech ledaktek b'ksivas ha'osiyos. We have to take care, we have to be very careful when we write and be precise. Ledaktek means to be precise when we write the osiyos. Shaloi tishtane tzuras shum achas be'en. We should not change the tzura, the form of any letter. Every letter has to be written in its precise form. V'loi tidme la'acheres. And certainly we should not write a letter in such a way that it could be mistaken for another letter. You write a dalet in such a way that it could look like a resh, or a beis so that it could look like a chaf. That's certainly a problem. So the Mechaber said over here that you have to be very precise when you go ahead and write the tefillin, to make sure to write the letters the right way, and make sure not to change the form of a letter. And the Mechaber says it certainly make sure not to change the form of a letter in a way that will allow it to be mistaken for a different letter. Says the Mishnah Berurah back on the bottom of Samach Hamad Aleph, Ois Katan Aleph, Biksivas. The wording of the Mechaber was Tzarech ledaktek b'ksivas ha'osiyos. We have to be very precise and very careful at the time that we write the osiyos. That's what the Mechaber says. Adds the Mishnah Berurah, it's not only at the time of the writing that you have to be careful. You have to be careful that the writing of the tefillin always remains proper. V'hu adinim nishtane ha'os b'tzurasa achar aksiva. It's also a problem if the form of the ois changes after it was written. Al yidei nekev. This could happen because maybe a hole formed in the cloth. So maybe a piece of a letter is missing because a piece of the parchment got punched out. So now part of the letter is missing, and maybe it's nishtane tzurasa. It doesn't look the same. A kera, or maybe the parchment, the cloth became torn. A tishtush, or it became rubbed out. The puzzle, in all of these cases, the tefillin would be puzzle. Ukedela el b'siman lamed beis. Ois cotton beis tzuras. We're talking about the tzura of the ois, the shape, the form of the ois. Says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu im shinei atzura hayarak b'miktzas ha'ois. This is true even if it's only a part of the letter that became changed. Kigoyin, for example, Shechasar harosh shala aleph. When we have an aleph, right? An aleph has the central portion, the diagonal line. Then there's a yud on top, on the right hand, and a little regel, a little foot, that connects that yud to the central body of the aleph. Says the Mishnah Berurah, when the Mechaber says that we have to take care that the tzuras ha'ois, the proper form of the ois, is not compromised, he means, says the Mishnah Berurah, even if only part of the letter is compromised. Let's say the yud at the top of the aleph, let's say that yud got knocked off. It got rubbed out. So you still have the regel maybe coming off the central portion of the aleph, but you don't have the yud anymore. That's a change in the tzuras ha'ois. That's a problem. Or even the kutzai shel yud, the little lower left hand, little leg that comes off the left side of the bottom of the yud. There's a little protrusion down there. Even if that's taken off, that changes the tzura of the yud from what it's supposed to look like. Or another way that the form of the ois could be changed. Instead of the aleph having a yud on the upper right side and then a little foot attaching it to the body of the aleph, maybe it's just one broad stroke, so that that entire thing is just connected to the gag of the aleph, to the central portion of the aleph, not with a thin little line, so it's recognizable that there's a yud and then an attachment. Instead, it's just one broad stroke that forms the top right-hand side of the aleph and connects it to the body. That's a problem. That's a change in the tzuras ha'ois. And even if a child will come and say, yeah, that's an aleph, that's not effective. We know that the child is going to recognize it as an aleph and call it an aleph. Right? If I take my little piece of paper over here, that aleph over there, there's no question that a tinoik is going to recognize that as an aleph. But you don't have a yud up here, and you don't have a yud down here. All you have is a broad stroke of the pen forming the top right-hand side, and a broad stroke of the pen forming the bottom left-hand side of the aleph. That's not the tzura of an aleph. That's not the tzura of an aleph. The tzura of an aleph that's the tzura of an aleph. You've got the yud. The tzura of an aleph has a yud, not just a broad pen stroke. So even if the tinoik will look at it and say it's an aleph, that doesn't help us at all, because we know that the tzuras ha'ois is compromised. Ois cotton gimel la'acheres, the Mechaber said, so we have two problems that the Mechaber mentioned. One was if the tzura of the ois is compromised, it doesn't have the proper form. But the other one is, sometimes you could change a letter in a way that it looks like a different letter. You could have a dalet that looks like a reish that looks like a dalet. That's a problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, he adds on over here, Ra'isi b'sefer ma'aseh rekeach, the Chavetz Chaim says he saw in the rekeach, shehevi l'dino b'shem tshuvas mahar al nach, who brings down halacha l'maaseh in the name of the tshuvas mahar al nach, who I don't know who that is, Siman Aleph, shekosav, where he writes, ta'afilu im rak miktzas ha'ois nidmeh la'ois acher. Even if only part of the letter was changed so that it looks like a different letter, puzzle, it would be puzzle. What does that mean? So I think a good example of what that means would be the ois of a kuf. I'm making a quick kuf over here, and I'll show you what I mean. Here we have basically a kuf. Okay? Here we have a kuf. The kuf, you have the top piece, and then you have this, which is essentially a nun seifis that forms the regel of the kuf. Now let's say I change the kuf a little. Now I took the kuf, and at the top of the kuf, I made a very long tag going up. What does that look like? Well, in order to show you what it looks like, let me cover up the nun seifis part of the kuf. Guess what? How do you like that limud over there? See, there's the end of nun part, the end of nun aspect of the kuf. But look what happens when I cover it. I now kind of turned the top of the kuf into a limud. But did I change the entire kuf? No. I only made a change to the top of the kuf so that now the top portion of the kuf looks like a limud. But I didn't change the bottom of the kuf at all. So says the Mishnah Berurah in the name of this Tshuvas Maral Nach, Ta'afilu imrak miktas ha'ois din meloi sacher posel, but u'medivrei agra le'el b'siman lamed beis, if yud ches, loy mashma kain. It's from the words of the gra, it sounds not like that. V'chein kasav ha'pri chadash, and so agrees the pri chadash. The gra that he's referring to over here is a gra that we had earlier that spoke about the letter ches. Let's remember that in the Sefer Torah or in tefillin, the ches essentially is two zainin that is connected by a chateteris, a gag, a roof. See this? We have a zayin and another zayin, and the connecting little piece on top. Now, how about if you make kind of a standard Ashuris ches, not a Sefer Torah type ches. How about if we make a ches like this ches? Okay? This ches is essentially made like a hay, but in a hay, this regel wouldn't be attached to the gag. So I made a hay and I attached the regel all the way to the gag. Now, if this would appear in our printed Chamashim or our printed Sidurim, we would call that a ches. It's only in the Sefer Torah, tefillin, and mezuzahs that we make this kind of funny ches. In print, we usually make this ches. Now, the Gra says that that's okay. That would be kosher. Why? Because it's recognizable. It's recognizable as a ches because the regel, it's not a hay, because the regel touches the gag. So we know that it's a ches, not a hay. Yet it's nishtane mitzuras ches, it's changed from the normal tzura of the ches because it has a gag going over the entire top. So it looks partially like a hay. And yet the Gra says that that's okay. So that indicates to us that the Gra disagrees with this Tshuvas Maharal Nach, and he holds if it's only part of the letter that was changed, it's okay. Okay, now let's go to the Ramah. Says the Ramah, top line here on Samach Aviv Beis, top line in the Shulchan Aruch. Lechatchila yichtayv b'ksiva tama. Lechatchila we have to write in a perfect writing. Kimavur b'tor u'b'shar paiskim, in the way that the letters are described to us by the Torah and the other paiskim. V'hu yadua eitzel haseifrim, and that method of writing is well known to the seifrim. Mi u'b'shina b'tzuras aksav ain't puzzle, but if you change from that tzura, the writing is not puzzle. The tefillin are not puzzle. Okay, what did the Ramah just tell me here? Well, we have the Mechaber. The Mechaber says that you have to be very careful when you write, not to change the tzura of the oisiyos, not to change the accepted form of any of the letters, and to make sure that you don't make a letter in such a way that it looks like a different letter. Says the Ramah, lechatchila, we have to write with a ksiva tama. We have to write with a perfect writing. What is this ksiva tama? The ksiva tama is that the letters have to be written with every minute detail given to us by the paiskim. And then the Ramah says, "Miu ibshina b'tzuras aksav einay puzzle." But there are changes to the tzuras ha'os that if you make them, it's not puzzle. And what we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah, that what comes out of this Ramah is every letter has a lot of different details as to how they have to be written. Some of those details are rooted in the Gemara. Some of those details are very grounded in Shas and Poskim. If you make changes to those details, the letter is puzzle and the tefillin could be puzzle. But then there are other factors to the formation of each individual ois. There might be details in the formation of an ois that don't appear in the Gemara. If it's not rooted in Dina Deshas, that if you make a change in that area, it can still be kosher. Let's take a look here and see this inside in the Mishnah Berurah Cut and Dalet. B'ksiva Tama. The Ramah says that lechatchila we have to write with ksiva Tama, with a perfect writing. Ritzayna Loimar, what the Ramah wants to say is ksiva Tama Ushlema. We need a perfect, complete writing with all of the details. B'tmunas ha'oisiyos, with all of the details of the formation of the letters. Kifi masha lamdu me'atalmid v'kabalas ha'rishonim v'al piasoid. Really, lechatchila, each letter has to be written with all of its details that we learn from Gemara, from the Poskim, from the Rishonim, from Kabbalah, al pisoid. There are details in the writings of the letter that we only know from Kabbalah. Lechatchila, we must incorporate all of these details into our writing. Like the Beis Yosef goes on in great detail in this Siman to describe each and every letter. That's lechatchila. Now, b'di'eved, ois cut hey in the Mishnah Berurah, im shina, if you do make a change to the formation of the letters, then the Ramah said, einoi puzzle, it's not puzzle. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, hainu, shaloi kosav tmunas ha'oisiyos hamuzkarim basvarim. You didn't write the letter with all of its details that are brought down in the Svarim. Aval tmunas ha'ois b'yutzarich, but you at least have the form of the letter. Certainly you can't leave it looking like another letter. So, what the Ramah is telling us, says the Mishnah Berurah, is that sometimes you could be mishaneh and you don't write the letter properly in all of its details, the way we find it brought down in Shas and Poskim. But it could still be kosher. The camera's out of focus there. 1 second. That usually helps. Hello, camera. Okay. Sometimes you write the letter in a proper enough fashion. You have the shape of the letter that is necessary b'di'evet. You don't have all the details lechatchila. Lechatchila, you should write it with all the details that we learn in Gemara, that we learn from Kabbalah, that we have a Kabbalah from the Rishonim. And now the Mishnah Berurah says, "V'hakavana k'moshe kasav ha'noida b'Yehuda." To understand this thoroughly, we could really look at the wording of the Noida b'Yehuda Siman Pei. And he says like this: "The davar she'ein lo shirish b'Gemara," a detail of a letter, how it's supposed to be written, a detail that's not mentioned in Shas, ein lifsala oisav orzeh. You're not going to make a letter puzzle because there's a detail in the writing of the letter that was done wrong, but that requirement is not mentioned in Shas. If it's not mentioned in Shas and you left it out, it's still kosher. Now says the Chavetz Chaim, in order for the reader who's here reading Mishnah Berurah, in order for us who are learning Mishnah Berurah to know what details of the letters are required, lechatchila, v'gam ezer prat yesh lo shirish, which details are taka rooted in the Gemara, v'hume ikar twinas ha'oisiyos sheyeh zeh likuva afilu b'di'evet. All of these things that are mentioned in Shas would be even ma'akiv. So says the Chavetz Chaim, in order for you, the reader, us, the people learning Mishnah Berurah, in order for us to know what is a strict requirement. Lachein, therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, his chazakti be'ezras Hashem yisbarach, I strengthened myself with the help of the Rabbeinu Shalom, va'asisi al zeh kuntris miyuchad, and I made a special, specific kuntris, a sefer, just to address this question, to go through the Aleph Beis and tell you which details of the writing of each letter are strict requirements and which are not. And the Chavetz Chaim says the information to write this kuntris I pulled together from the words of the Beis Yosef, the Pri Megadim, and others. Tumunas kala oisyos lamaisa, the proper forming of each letter halacha lamaisa. Ukarasiv b'shem Mishnah Seifrim, and I named this kuntris Mishnah Seifrim. V'chalalti by, and I included in this sefer gam kitzer klali dine hakavas gvil v'chak toichais, also some of the halachas that govern the requirement of hakafas gvil, that every letter has to be surrounded by blank parchment, the chak toichais, and the requirement that we have to write the letters. We can't form the letters by cutting out ink. In other words, you can't make a square, a solid square of ink on the cloth, then take an X-Acto knife and scrape out the inside of it in order to form an end-to-end. That would be chak toichais. V'shaloi kisidron, and the halachas that govern the fact that the tefillin have to be written in order. He says the Chavetz Chaim, so that people should understand how the tefillin are to be written, I wrote this kuntris of Mishnah Seifrim, that we Amir Hashem, it's here in the Mishnah Berurah. If you turn a couple of pages, you'll see this Mishnah Seifrim. It discusses the proper formation of each and every letter, and Amir Hashem will be going through that Mishnah Seifrim as we go ahead. Okay, we'll stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Beis. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be making like Hans Klal Yisrael. The Rabban Shalom should send Yeshua for us parnasa to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the B'yeskel Tzedek b'meherav Yameinu. Amen. Be well.